Sunlight filtered through grimy courtroom windows, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Martha Wilson shuffled forward, the chains around her ankles creating a solemn rhythm that echoed through the hushed chamber. Her weathered hands, once strong enough to carry children and heavy grocery bags, now trembled as they clutched the frayed edges of a coat that had long ago lost its color. The fluorescent lights above revealed every line etched into her 78-year-old face, a map of hardships endured and joys long forgotten. Her silver hair, unwashed but attempting dignity in a loose bun, framed eyes that had seen too much yet somehow retained a quiet spark of resilience. The bailiff guided her forward with practiced indifference. Case number 4673, Commonwealth versus Martha Wilson, charge of criminal trespassing, he announced, his voice a monotone that had announced hundreds before her. The courtroom barely stirred. The morning docket was full, and an elderly homeless woman was just another faceless name on a long list of society's forgotten. Martha raised her chin slightly, a small act of defiance against the weight of shame pressing down on her shoulders. She had only been seeking shelter from the biting Chicago winter, huddled in the hallway of an abandoned apartment building when the police found her. Now she stood accused, her existence itself somehow criminal. Judge Eleanor Bennett entered, and the room rose in mechanical respect. She took her seat with practiced efficiency, her black robe settling around her like armor. Her gaze, normally sharp and assessing, traveled to the defendant standing before her. She opened the case file, skimming the sparse details of another routine trespassing case. Martha Wilson, she read aloud, the name hanging in the air between them. And then the impossible happened. The judge's composed expression cracked. Her fingers, always steady even in the most dramatic testimony, froze mid-page. Her eyes darted from the paper to the elderly woman's face, searching, disbelieving. "Martha Wilson," she repeated, her professional demeanor suddenly fragile. Martha squinted through cloudy eyes at the judge, confusion evident on her weathered face. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice a whisper strengthened by decades of perseverance. Judge Bennett's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, finding the small silver locket hidden beneath her robes, a talisman carried through law school, through her rise to the bench, through 20 years of administering justice, a locket containing a faded photograph of a woman whose face now stood before her, older but unmistakable. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," Judge Bennett announced abruptly, her voice wavering just enough for the court reporter to glance up in surprise. The gavel fell with uncharacteristic force, and "Find this woman representation immediately." The early morning light cut across the empty courtroom as Judge Eleanor Bennett sat alone at her bench, door locked against interruption. Memories flooded back. A cramped apartment in Chicago's South Side, where her mother worked double shifts at the hospital. Eleanor, then just little Ellie, age 7, left alone too often with her infant brother Tommy. The neighbor who noticed. The woman who brought over casseroles and checked on them without being asked. The same woman who, during the blizzard of '63, when their heat went out, had taken them into her own small apartment for 3 days, telling them stories of her childhood in Tennessee until they forgot they were afraid. Martha Wilson, the woman who had saved her life before she even understood it needed saving. The bailiff's knock interrupted her thoughts. "Your Honor, Ms. Wilson's public defender has arrived." Eleanor quickly wiped her eyes and straightened her robe. "Send them in." The young public defender, James Mitchell, entered with the harried look of someone already carrying too many cases and too little time. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I've only had a moment to review—" "Mr. Mitchell," Eleanor interrupted, her judicial mask firmly back in place. "I'd like you to have a proper conversation with your client. This case requires special attention." Mitchell looked surprised but nodded. Of course, Your Honor. And, Mr. Mitchell, please inform Ms. Wilson that her case will be heard last today. I want to ensure adequate time. The courtroom had mostly emptied by the time Martha Wilson's case was recalled. The afternoon sun had softened, casting gentler shadows across the judge's bench. Martha had been given a chair, her shackles removed, small mercies granted by a whispered word from the judge to the bailiff. Your Honor, Mitchell began, my client was merely seeking shelter from the elements when— Tell me about yourself. Ms. Wilson, Eleanor interrupted, her voice softer than anyone in that courtroom had ever heard it. Martha looked confused. Your Honor? Before we address the charges, I'd like to know your circumstances. How long have you been without housing? Martha's gaze dropped to her mismatched shoes. 3 years now, Your Honor. Since the fire took my building and everything in it. They said there'd be assistance, but the paperwork, I couldn't keep up with it all. And before that, where did you live? Same neighborhood for 60 years, Your Honor. Worked as a nurse's aide at Chicago General until my arthritis got. And too bad. Then did some childcare for working families until— She gestured vaguely at her worn body, explanation enough for why those opportunities had dried up. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her pen. Did you ever live in the Parkview Apartments on Dearborn Street in the 1960s? Martha's eyes widened slightly. Yes, ma'am, for nearly 20 years. How did you— Apartment 3C, Eleanor's voice barely carried to the court reporter. Martha's weathered face transformed with surprise. That's right. Did you know the Bennett family in 2B? Single mother, 2 young children? The courtroom had gone completely still. The prosecutor, who'd been preparing to argue for a standard 30-day sentence, slowly closed his folder. Mitchell looked between his client and the judge in confusion. Martha's cloudy eyes cleared for a moment with recognition. Little Ellie and baby Tommy? Her gaze traveled over the judge's face, seeing beyond the title and position to something long buried. My God, is that you, Ellie? Judge Eleanor Bennett, known throughout Cook County for her unflinching application of the law, felt tears spill onto her cheeks. You used to make us cinnamon toast, she whispered, no longer a judge, but once again a hungry child standing in a neighbor's warm kitchen. You braided my hair for school when Mom had night shifts. Mitchell stared in astonishment. The prosecutor quietly closed his briefcase. The court reporter's hands hovered motionless above her stenotype. I remember, Martha said, her own eyes filling. You were such a serious little thing. Always with a book, looking after your brother like a little mother yourself. Eleanor's composure crumbled further. You took us in during the blizzard. You saved us. Martha shook her head. I just did what neighbors do. For 3 nights, the Wilson family had sheltered Ellie and Tommy Bennett as the worst blizzard in Chicago's history paralyzed the city. Their mother, trapped at the hospital where she worked, had called in tears of gratitude when the phone lines finally cleared. But it wasn't just the blizzard, it was the countless afternoons when Martha offered safety, nourishment and care without being asked, a quiet guardian ensuring 2 vulnerable children weren't left to face the world alone. And now, decades later, that same woman stood accused before the child she had protected, her existence criminalized by the very society she had once held together with small acts of compassion. Eleanor rose from the bench. An unprecedented breach of protocol. Case dismissed, she declared, her voice finding judicial strength even through emotion. This court finds that no crime has been committed, the prosecutor began. Your Honor, with all due respect to your personal connection, the law clearly states— The law, Eleanor said, turning to him with years of hard-earned authority, is meant to protect our communities. Miss Wilson has done more to protect this community, to protect me, than any statute we've enforced today. She turned to Martha. "And the law has failed you in return." What happened next would become courthouse legend. Judge Bennett descended from the bench, crossed the courtroom floor, and embraced the defendant. The bailiff, trained to prevent exactly such contact, found himself frozen in place by the raw humanity unfolding before him. "I never thought I'd see you again," Eleanor whispered. "Look at you," Martha replied, her weathered hand touching Eleanor's cheek with the same gentleness she had shown decades earlier. "A judge, I always knew you'd do something important." Eleanor stepped back, suddenly aware of the courtroom's stunned silence. She turned to Mitchell. "Counselor, I'm recusing myself from this case for obvious reasons." Then to the prosecutor. "And I'm ordering a comprehensive review of Ms. Wilson's situation, with full consideration for emergency housing, medical care, and back benefits." The prosecutor nodded, recognizing the extraordinary nature of the moment. Eleanor turned back to Martha. "Where have you been staying? Tonight, I mean." Martha's eyes dropped again. "There's a shelter on Jackson, but it fills up early." "Not tonight," Eleanor said firmly. "Mr. Mitchell, please inform the clerk that court is adjourned. Ms. Wilson will be coming home with me." Later that evening, as Chicago's streetlights flickered to life against the gathering darkness, Martha Wilson sat at Judge Eleanor Bennett's kitchen table, her gnarled hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The modest but comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood felt like another world from the streets she had navigated for years. "I can't accept all this," Martha protested as Eleanor set out a plate of sandwiches. "You've already done too much." "I've done nothing yet," Eleanor replied, taking the seat across from her. "But I'm going to. The guest room is made up for you, for as long as you need it." Martha shook her head. "I don't want to be a charity case, Ellie. I've managed this long." "This isn't charity," Eleanor said firmly. "This is repayment of a debt, one I've carried my whole life without even knowing where to send the payment." She reached across the table, hesitating before placing her hand over Martha's. "Do you know what happened to us after you disappeared?" Martha's eyes clouded. "I heard your mother passed. I was already gone by then. My husband got a job in Detroit. We meant to keep in touch, but life happens," Eleanor finished for her. "Yes, Mom died when I was 16. Tommy was 10. They were going to separate us in the system." Her voice caught. "But I remembered what you showed me, how to be strong for someone else. I convinced the court to let me be his guardian once I turned 18. Worked nights, got him through school, then put myself through school." Martha's eyes shone with unshed tears. "You did that." "I did that because of you," Eleanor said simply. "You showed me what it meant to care for someone beyond obligation, how to create family where the world says none exists." Outside, a light snow began to fall, transforming Chicago's concrete landscape into something softer, more forgiving. Inside, two women, separated by decades and circumstance, found themselves building a bridge across that divide, one careful word at a time. "I can stay a night or two," Martha conceded finally, "until we figure something out." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the same pride she herself carried. "That's all I ask, for now." That night, Eleanor made a series of calls to colleagues on the housing board, to a doctor friend who owed her a favor, to her brother Tommy, now a successful architect in Boston. Wheels were set in motion. Plans were made. In her guest room, Martha Wilson slept in a real bed for the first time in years, her dreams uncrowded by fear for the first time in longer than she could remember. Morning arrived with golden light and the smell of coffee. Martha found Eleanor in the kitchen, already dressed for court, but cooking breakfast as if this were a normal routine they had shared for years. "I made some calls," Eleanor said, sliding a plate of eggs toward Martha. There's an apartment opening up in a senior building next month. Good neighborhood, rent-controlled. Until then, you're staying here." Martha opened her mouth to protest, but Eleanor held up a hand. "This isn't up for negotiation, Martha. Consider it a court order if you must." A smile cracked Martha's weathered face. "You always were a stubborn child." "Wonder where I learned that," Eleanor replied, returning the smile. The phone rang and Eleanor answered it, her expression turning serious. "Yes, I understand. Thank you." She hung up and turned to Martha. "That was social services. They've expedited your case, but they need documentation, birth certificate, social security card." Martha's face fell. Lost in the fire. Everything was lost. Eleanor nodded, having expected this. "We'll start from scratch then. I've taken the day off." She checked her watch. "Tommy's flight gets in at noon. He couldn't believe it when I told him we found you." "Tommy's coming?" Martha's voice trembled. "Little Tommy?" "Not so little anymore. 2 kids of his own now." Eleanor sat down across from Martha. "He said his first memory is of you singing to him during the blizzard. He never forgot." Martha pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. What followed was a day unlike any in recent memory for either woman. Together, they navigated the labyrinthine processes of government bureaucracy, Eleanor's judicial badge opening doors that would have remained firmly shut to Martha alone. They filled out forms, took numbers, waited in fluorescent-lit offices, where Martha's story elicited either compassion or indifference, depending on the civil servant assigned to them. Have you ever been invisible to a world you helped build? Have you known someone who gave everything only to find nothing remained for them when they needed it most? Through it all, Eleanor remained a fierce advocate, her courtroom authority, extending into every interaction. By afternoon, Martha had temporary ID, appointments for healthcare, and applications submitted for housing assistance and back benefits she had qualified for but never received. "I don't know how to thank you," Martha said as they left the final office. Eleanor squeezed her hand. "You already did, 40 years ago." At the airport, Thomas Bennett, a tall man with his sister's serious eyes and confident bearing, spotted them immediately. He dropped his carry-on bag and covered the distance between them in long strides. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice catching as he looked at the elderly woman who featured in his earliest memories. Without hesitation, he wrapped her in a gentle embrace. "You look exactly the same," Martha laughed through tears. "What a terrible liar you've become." Tommy pulled back, studying her face. "You still have the kindest eyes I've ever known." Over dinner at Eleanor's home, they pieced together the decades that had separated them. Martha's move to Detroit with her husband, the factory closing that sent them to Cleveland, then Pittsburgh, following diminishing opportunities. Her husband's death. Her return to Chicago, only to find her old neighborhood transformed beyond recognition, prices beyond reach. The slow descent from precariously housed to occasionally homeless to permanently street-bound. "The system is designed to let people fall through cracks," Eleanor said, the judge in her analyzing the structural failures. "Once you lose your address, you lose your ability to receive benefits that might help you get an address." "It's a perfect trap," Tommy agreed, the architect seeing the flawed design. "It's just life," Martha said simply, the survivor who had navigated it all. After dinner, Tommy showed Martha photos of his children, a boy and girl who shared the Wilson name as their middle names, a tribute to the woman who had sheltered their father and aunt during their most vulnerable years. "They know all about you," Tommy told her. "I've been telling them the blizzard story their whole lives. They call it the 3 days of magic." Martha's eyes widened. "You remembered that? The stories I told?" "Everyone," Eleanor confirmed. "The Tennessee farm, the hidden lake, the talking fox. Tommy and I would retell them to each other for years after. Later, when Tommy had gone to his hotel and Martha was settled in the guest room, Eleanor sat alone in her living room, holding the silver locket that contained a faded photograph of a younger Martha, a picture Tommy had taken with their mother's camera during that blizzard, developed weeks later and treasured ever since. The judge, who was known for her unwavering application of the law, found herself confronting a deeper truth, that sometimes justice required more than the law could provide, that sometimes healing required a human hand rather than a gavel's fall. The next several weeks brought transformation for both women. Eleanor, typically private about her personal life, found herself sharing Martha's story with colleagues, community leaders, and eventually a journalist friend who saw something powerful in their reconnection. Martha, despite initial reluctance, allowed her story to be told, not as a tale of personal misfortune, but as evidence of systemic failure. "If it happens to someone like me, with a judge in my corner," she told the journalist, "imagine what happens to those without such connections." The article ran first in the Chicago Tribune, then was picked up nationally. Homeless grandmother. And the judge she once saved became a focal point for discussions about elder poverty, housing insecurity, and the invisible threads of community that both bind and fray. Eleanor faced some criticism for her courtroom actions that day, the embrace, the personal involvement, the bending of protocol. A judicial review was briefly considered but ultimately dismissed. As one committee member noted, sometimes the human element of justice must take precedence over its mechanical application. More importantly, Martha's case opened doors for others. Eleanor, working with legal aid organizations, established a specialized docket for elderly defendants facing housing-related charges. Tommy, inspired by his reunion with Martha, began designing affordable housing specifically for seniors, with his firm committing to projects in Chicago's underserved neighborhoods. The apartment promised to Martha became a reality, a small but sunny one-bedroom in a well-maintained building for seniors. Eleanor helped furnish it with comforts Martha had gone without for years: a proper bed, soft towels, cookware for the simple meals she loved to prepare. "It's too much," Martha protested when she saw it completed. "It's exactly enough," Eleanor countered. "It's what anyone deserves." On moving day, a small gathering celebrated Martha's new beginning. Tommy flew in with his children, eager to introduce them to the woman who featured so prominently in their family lore. Eleanor's colleagues brought housewarming gifts. Neighbors from the building stopped by, curious about the new resident whose story had appeared in the morning paper. Among the guests was James Mitchell, the public defender who had witnessed that extraordinary moment in court. "I've been practicing law for 7 years, he told Martha as she showed him her new kitchen. "That day changed how I see my work." "Thank you for that." Martha, unused to such attention, simply squeezed his hand in response. As the party wound down, Eleanor found Martha standing by the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline bathed in sunset light. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Eleanor asked, joining her. Martha smiled, a genuine expression that erased years from her face. "I was thinking about that blizzard, how scared you and Tommy were at first, how by the 3rd day it felt like we'd always been together." Eleanor nodded, the memory vivid. "You made us feel safe when the world outside was frozen chaos. And now you've done the same for me," Martha said softly. Eleanor took Martha's weathered hand in hers. "That's how it should work, don't you think? We hold each other up when needed. We remember each other when the world forgets." Martha turned from the window to face Eleanor fully. "I never had children of my own, you know. John and I tried, but it wasn't meant to be." "I know," Eleanor said gently, "but seeing you two, what you've become, makes me feel like maybe I did something right in this world after all." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "You did everything right, Martha, and now it's our turn to get it right for you." As evening settled over Chicago, two women whose lives had intersected, separated and reunited against impossible odds, stood together in quiet understanding. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. Inside, in a small apartment filled with new beginnings, time moved more gently. Eleanor would visit weekly, bringing groceries and news of the world beyond. Tommy would call regularly, his children sending handmade cards that Martha displayed proudly on her refrigerator. The judicial system that had once processed Martha as just another anonymous defendant now recognized her as a catalyst for change. Small miracles, perhaps. But in a world that too often overlooked its most vulnerable members, these connections shone like beacons against the darkness. "I never thought I'd have a home again," Martha admitted on that first night in her new apartment. "That's the thing about homes," Eleanor replied, echoing wisdom Martha herself had once shared during a long-ago blizzard. "Sometimes we find them in the most unexpected places. Sometimes they find us." Martha Wilson slept soundly that night, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. And Judge Eleanor Bennett returned to her courtroom the next morning with renewed purpose, carrying with her the knowledge that true justice sometimes required looking beyond the law to the human heart, beating beneath it. For in the end, it wasn't the courtroom that had provided healing. It was the recognition that had occurred within it. The moment when two souls, separated by time and circumstance, had seen and remembered each other. Congratulations. Type. And down in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel,